Okay, hello and welcome to episode 2 of the Final Fantasy Z card game. In this episode, we're going to be discussing the general flow of play and just how to play the game. So, to kick things off, you begin the game with your limit breaks and characters already in play. So, in this game, we're going to be demonstrating just a short tutorial of Knights of the Round as your limit break, Cloud, Tifa, and Aerith versus Sephiroth, and of course he's got his limit break card, Safer Sephiroth. And we're just going to jump right into this. So typically you'd roll a dice to decide who wins, or who goes first, sorry. And to do that on Octagon, if you do choose to play on this platform, you just hit Control R. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. We're going to pretend as if Cloud, Aerith, and Tifa have won the roll, and we're just going to go ahead and begin the game with the draw step. And this is the same throughout the game. There's no drawing one card extra on the first turn or anything like that. Every turn is exactly the same in Final Fantasy Z. So we're going to draw our 3. 1, 2, 3. And there are no planning cards, unfortunately. So the next step after your draw step would be your planning step. This is where you'd play those equipment cards, setup cards, but unfortunately we didn't draw any here. And honestly, against Sephiroth, he's a very aggressive character. You just want to pass, at least in this instance. You don't have a great hand to go up against Sephiroth. So at the end of your planning step, you would make a decision to enter combat or not, based on the quality of your hand, how set up you are in the game to succeed over your opponent, because the real meat of this game is going to happen in combat. Everything else is kind of preparing and vying for advantage over your opponent until you reach that point where you're actually in combat. So we're going to go ahead and choose not to enter combat this turn and enter our discard step. And during that step, you discard down to 1 or 0. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll discard this Reflect and discard Carbuncle. And on a turn where you did not enter combat, you get what's called the Rejuvenation step. And if you did not enter combat, you get to rejuvenate 1 card. Simply take the top card of your discard pile and put it on the bottom of your deck. And that is going to be a single turn of Final Fantasy Z. Let's go ahead and go to Sephiroth. I'm going to make sure his deck is shuffled, and let's draw 3 cards. It's now our turn. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so we've got 3 attack cards. Frankly, this hand is not very good, but for video's sake, I'm going to go ahead and enter combat. So, and in that case, your opponent gets to draw 3 cards. Whew, that's a monster of a hand, actually. So now, your opponent's drawn their 3 cards, you have your 3 cards. You are both going to be taking actions. So Sephiroth's going to go, Cloud, Aerith, Tifa go, Sephiroth goes, Cloud, Aerith, Tifa goes, and this will continue back and forth until somebody has 0 cards left in their deck. Or maybe you're completely out of actions or strategically pass and combat ends, because not only can I play cards and use my power as an action, but you could also simply, hey, I just want to pass, and that's a perfectly fine action. However, if both players pass, combat will end and you'll both discard down to 1 or 0. So let's go ahead and just perform an attack here so you can get a feel for what that looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and play Shall I Give You Despair. This card, if we take a look at it, it does cost 1. I explained cost in the previous video. We're going to go ahead and take the top card of our deck and discard it. That is cost. And one thing to keep in mind is cost is discard with a capital D. So any cards that trigger when discarded, they have like a special effect. When this card is discarded, you do something, they'll trigger off of cost as well. So we're going to go ahead and play this Shall I Give You Despair card. It's a floating effect, which I'll explain more here in a second. I'm going to hit the zones. But for now, we're going to perform this attack for 5 damage. Now, when you attack your opponent, it's decision time for them. They get an opportunity to play a block card, like this equal footing. It stops the sword's attack, so we could stop this attack. But for the video's sake, I'm going to go ahead and say Cloud Air and Tifa are going to take this attack, and they're just going to take the, this would be 5 damage from this. So let's go ahead and do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so when you're performing attacks, it's straight up removing the top cards of your opponent's deck, removing with the lowercase r, as we're going to talk about here in a second. But the player with 0 cards first is the loser of the game. So if you're able to reduce your opponent to 0 cards faster than your opponent, that is how you win the game. And that is the question the game asks: who can reduce who first? And with that, we're going to go ahead and pretend that everybody's actions is played out, or for some reason this combat has ended prematurely, and we're both going to discard down to 1. We're going to just go ahead and act this action out. So I'm going to go to Sephiroth's side real quick too, and one thing to keep in mind is your floating effects, and this is a great opportunity to get into the zones of the game. Your floating effects at the end of combat, well, when you use a card with floating effect, it enters a special area called the floating effect area. That's going to exist out to one of the sides of your game board, right? And these cards, they stay there for the duration of combat. They're going to be floating out there until combat ends. And at the end of combat, you simply take it and remove it from the game. And one thing to think about as well is your summon cards. If they're out here in play, as we discussed in the last video, they'll be discarded at the end of combat as well. So Sephiroth's combat has ended, so we're going to go ahead and remove that Shall I Give You Despair and discard down to 1 card. And then, because we've completed our discard step now, but because we entered combat, we do not get a rejuvenation step. We don't get to rejuvenate this card. So we're just going to put it in our discard pile, and it would be the opponent's turn. And this ebb and flow will continue back and forth until a winner is decided. Anyway, getting onto the zones, we discussed the floating effect area. Any card that says floating effect as part of their effect, you immediately move it. Once you hit that line, move it to your floating effect area. And there it can be interacted with or completely ignored by your opponent, depending on the cards they have available to them. So that's one of your zones. Of course, you have your deck, which is going to be a maximum deck size of 40 cards in this game. When it's reduced to 0, you lose the game. Next will be your discard pile. Any card that says discard or discard after use, discard your opponent's setup, discard this, discard that. Any card with that type of effect is going to go there. Any card that just has a simple power or something like that is discarded after use unless it says otherwise. And then your removed area is going to be anything that says remove. If a card says remove after use or remove your opponent's equipment card or setup card, those cards are going to go here to the second pile, your removed area. Anyway, that hits all the zones and a general flow of play for you to get started in this card game. And in the next video, we're going to be breaking down some of the mechanics and keywords of the game. Thank you so much for joining me for episode 2, and I look forward to seeing you in episode 3.